Hello, and welcome to the Copyblogger podcast. My name is Tim Stoddart. Thank you so much for joining me. It's easy to feel on top of the world when things are going well in life. Inevitably, we all come across challenges and hardships. My guest today used his hardships as inspiration to create one of the most popular podcasts of the time. Bilal Zaidi is the host of Creator Labs. Bilal interviews world-class entrepreneurs in hopes to learn the skills, tips, and strategies that he can apply to his own consulting business. One of the things I like most about Bilal's podcast is his curiosity. When he interviews guests, you can truly feel the curiosity and the eagerness to learn, which is why he has booked guests such as Gary Vaynerchuk, Daymond John, Erika Alexander, Feresteh Forough, Dru Riley, and more. I loved this conversation. Bilal has a great personality, and he was so generous with his experience and his knowledge. You will absolutely level up by listening to this episode. With that, please help me welcome Bilal Zaidi. Bilal, thank you so much for coming on the show. I've been a big fan of your podcast. It's actually been, you know how in podcasts you kind of go on like rotations. You got like your new favorite podcast every couple of months. You've been my new favorite podcast on my walks for the last couple of weeks. So it's great to talk to you.
I appreciate it, man. Yeah, thanks a lot. And like I said, I've been following the site for a long time as well. So it's cool to collide.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I start off all of my podcasts with the same question: the background of your Twitter bio. Tell me what it is and what it means to you.
I don't even know what's in it. I feel like it's, I wrote this ages ago and just kept it. So let me just have a look right now. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I feel like I need a little work on mine. But yeah, mine says host of Creator Lab, deep convos with the world's leading entrepreneurs, ex-Google and Charity Water, London and NYC, show every Wednesday. So that's my ad for people listening. But yeah, I guess what it is, yeah, that's probably for what I use Twitter for, which is mostly for my podcast and sharing stuff related to business. That's kind of why I've positioned it around that. And yeah, the podcast itself is, I've interviewed people like Pomp, the founder of Square, Gary V, Daymond John, Kat Cole, Sam Parr, a bunch of people that are really interesting, and especially in our world, I'm sure we follow a lot of those people and interested in kind of the work they're doing. And I've been doing that for about 5-6 years now. I started recording in 2015, launched in 2016, did it on the side, which is the next part of Google and Charity Water when I used to have a job. And I did it on the side originally because I needed some energy outside of my core job. And this was a place for me to like get meetings essentially with people I was interested in getting to know and like sharing their stories. But also beyond the story, eventually it got more about like, what's the stuff you're not hearing elsewhere? And I'm not a real journalist. I'm just a curious person who's got real business experience. So I was trying to understand, what is it like in their brains? Like, what do they go through that me and you who have actually gone through this can relate to? And yeah, so that's kind of how that started. And actually, episode 2 of the podcast was with Scott Harrison, the founder of Charity Water. And that's the next part of the bio, which was I was working at Charity Water eventually. So I left Google to join these guys for a couple of years. Had an incredible time there. And then last part, I'm a Londoner, as you can probably tell from my accent, but I'm based in New York, in Brooklyn right now. So you might hear some sirens outside during the call. And that's it. Yeah. And then I guess since we're here, CTA, go and check out the show if you want. It's the show every Wednesday. Is the last part of the bio.
I'm glad that you brought up the lessons that you've learned and the curiosity that you had. This seems to be kind of a common thread in my show because, like most people, I'm about 150 episodes in, so I'm not a podcast rookie by any means, but I've still surprised where when I started my podcast, I'm thinking like everybody does, like I need a new marketing channel, right? I need to get my name out there. I want some recognition. And what's happened is that all of those things, the value that I've gotten from my show has been it's been secondary to just the great conversations that I've had with super smart people and the lessons that I've come away with it. And also like the relationships, right? It's a funny thing where if you ask somebody to coffee, they'll say no. But if you say like, hey, will you come on my podcast?
Completely.
And like,
there's something in it for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So just speak on that, man. Like you have one of the more successful podcasts. You've been doing it for years, and I'm always curious to know at the end of the day, what is it that you're getting out of it? Are you getting like the marketing? Are you getting the wisdom? Are you getting the lessons? Speak on that for me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's definitely all of those, but I hate that answer, so I'll be more specific. When I actually started, I had to kind of stack rank why I was doing it,
Yeah.
and doing it as long as you have as well. That after a while, it starts to wear down on you, and you're like, oh, now I need to post this, and I'm so tired. I've got a job, and for you, you might have a baby, and all this sort of stuff. So I had to really be quite specific. And I don't think it's changed too much. I'd say originally it was all about me just meeting good people. And just like you said, most of them will say no to coffee, but a lot of them are happy to meet in person for 2 hours and tell me their life story. And like, I can ask them anything as well, right? So if me and you met and I said, hey, tell me about your childhood, or like your relationship with your parents, or take me back to this moment, it's kind of weird, right? So, but if we do that in a podcast setting, I can ask anything I want. So, as you said, as someone who's quite curious, it's been a way for me just to say, but this is a way for me to go and flex that curiosity a little bit and really just tap into that part of my brain. And so that's one part. The second part, yeah, of course, it's now technically a business. It's been a business for a few years. I make some money from it. And it kind of helps everything else I do. So everything I do nowadays, I'm kind of optimizing for, is this something I can do for a long time? Do I really enjoy it? It sounds a bit cheesy, but do I get energy from it? And this is, having conversations with interesting people is one of the best things in the world for me. So whether that's like, friends meeting for dinner or drinks or doing a podcast, they're both really fun to me. So that's kind of the main reason I do it and what I get out of it. But then also just as someone who has a business and wants to create other things in the future. And also I'm a creative person too. So I'm able to kind of learn stuff from those people who've done it at a higher level. So just one guy's coming to mind right now, Tim Urban, if you've heard of him. He's got a blog called Wait But Why. Incredible blog, and he's got the #1 TED talk on the internet about procrastination. Really, really crazy dude. And just talking to him about his creative process and like how he writes and how he struggles with writing at times, and his time spent, he spent like months with Elon Musk and did these epic posts for Elon Musk, SpaceX and stuff like that. And just to get access to someone like that I can now, not to like name drop, but like I can text him, right? And that's I would never have had that if I asked him for coffee. So I think in the long life, those relationships compound, and the energy compounds, and also the knowledge. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about it, man.
When you started your show, you mentioned briefly that your show was born out of a catalyst of more or less just being in like a funky place, being in a dark place. This is a marketing podcast, and so we don't need to necessarily go down the rabbit hole, but I do think it's important for people to get that personalization, because I remember what it was like when I was just starting out, right? And we were talking about Brian Clark before we started recording. You see Brian and you're like, oh, this is so easy for him, right? Like he's already got it figured out. Maybe one day I'll get there. And then you get a little bit more experience and you realize that that's really all it is. It's just experience. And you're just getting a little bit more experience. And then you look back 5 years later and you're like, I don't feel any more special. Like I just feel like the same person with a little bit more experience. So what I'm looking for is talk to me about first that catalyst of where you were and why this was such a creative outlet for you. But then I want to hear about the journey on now you rocket ship yourself from that point where you needed to make a change. And 5 years later, you got like a real brand with a real business.
Yeah, man. Well, I'd say the catalyst is around, it probably started a little bit before, but like 2013 to 2015, I was pretty much in a pretty bad place. And again, not to turn this into a therapy session, but I don't want to say I was depressed, because I think there's a fine line between, clinically depressed and just being down. Mm-hmm. So whatever it was, I was just in a pretty bad place. And I think to rewind a little bit, I started out in, basically created a business when I was 16 years old. Not huge multi-million-dollar business or anything, but helped me pay through college. And at that moment already, I was like, this is what I'm going to do forever. I'm going to go back to doing my own stuff. And then I left. I went to Google, which was an incredible experience, but it wasn't really my plan. And then eventually, by the time I was a few years in, I'd moved to New York. I'm like, 25 years old or something like that. And, I was earning a good 6-figure salary, lived in the West Village, like all the things that you check the box of, like, this is what I've been working towards at quite a young age. And I was like, I'm just kind of dead inside, and there's not any meaning. I didn't move all the way here just to go out all the time and have fun with friends. Like, work is quite meaningful to me. So I needed a balance of that. I probably also needed to be in a relationship, which I wasn't at the time. I am now. And so all those things that with maturity, you realize, like, okay, yeah, there's only so much messing around you can do, running around the city doing stupid stuff. Eventually, you're going to wake up the next day and say, what am I spending 8 to 10 hours of my day doing? What am I actually doing in the evening? What am I building? And again, building isn't just a business. It's like relationships and things that you enjoy doing. So that was kind of the bad moment. And that got me thinking, like, well, what can I do? The best thing I could have done at the time was probably change jobs. But I was not on a green card. I didn't have a green card at the time. I was on a visa as a British citizen. So I couldn't essentially leave my job. I had to wait a few years for that. So yeah, I kind of needed to find something outside of that, and that's where the podcast was kind of born out of that. And remind me the second part to the question.
I don't remember. Oh shit,
right.
I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was. I'm trying to give some inspiration to somebody that's just starting off, looking at your successful podcast, who probably has those fears and those doubts that I used to have. And then what's like the piece of advice that everybody always gives, right? They say, just start. And every time I hear that, I want to like kind of throw up a little bit, because it is important to have
enough.
a plan. Yeah, exactly. Like it's not enough.
It's a good first step, but it's not really the full story, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. So now that you're 5 years into it and you have this perspective, here's the question. What would you have told that guy that was just starting the podcast?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I guess I would just say, stay focused on why you're doing this, because maybe you're similar to me, especially if you've got like a business background or you're numbers driven in any way. What happens is the ego takes over and the mathematical brain takes over, and you're like, how do I get 1 million downloads? How do I how do I grow 20% month over month, or whatever that you're used to doing, especially coming from a place like Google, where at that moment, just before, I'd worked on a startup at Google, which did, I think, like $300 million in revenue, and it got shut down because it wasn't big enough for Google's size, right? And that's the kind
stupid.
Of, it's so, it's crazy. But if they're a $1 trillion company, they just have to focus on the right stuff. So anyway, regardless, so that's where I'm coming from, these crazy big numbers. And then I'm also work, tangentially with YouTube, and I'm seeing all these people blow up, and you scroll on your feed and you see something with 1 million views. No one understands like what it takes to get to 1 million views. Like, that's a crazy amount, especially in podcasting is like divide by 10 all the numbers, because to convince someone to listen to an hour is different to a 4-minute video. So again, those numbers kind of make you a little crazy if you hyper focus on them. And this is something I read somewhere. I think it was like Amazon or someone talked about this, Jeff Bezos from Amazon. It was about like focusing on the inputs, not the outputs, which is all about like, what can I actually control? I can control creating a great piece of content every week. I can have a great conversation with someone and put it out, make sure I stick to my deadlines that I've set myself. And also the quality, like, is something that I've tried my best to stick to as well. What I can't control is how many people are actually going to listen, how many people who are listening are going to spread it, how many people are going to write a review, all the different growth factors that my mind typically goes to. So over time, like the last year has been where I've been the most consistent with doing it, because I took like quite a long break at one point because I started a new job and it was too crazy for me. But yeah, that's probably the best thing, and that's not just for podcasts, it's for everything I do now. It's like, what can I control? What can't I control? Still monitor what I can't control, of course. I'm not just saying it doesn't matter, but what are the things closest to me right now that are actually going to help? And also really just like enjoying the process, because if I don't enjoy doing the interviews and putting it out, and the little messages I get from people saying, hey, this changed my career, or I I started a company because of this. That's kind of why I'm doing it, right? Because, you know, to be frank, it doesn't make crazy amount of money that's the reason to do it. It just makes enough to keep it self-sustainable and for it to be a part of my life. Maybe one day that'll change, but at the moment, that's kind of where I'm at with it.
I want to talk about that balancing act of monitoring data and numbers while also doing the creative work for the sake of doing the creative work. That's hard, man. And I think no matter how much experience you get, there's always an ebb and flow where some mornings I wake up and I think I'm deleting Google Analytics from all of my websites. Because I'm an SEO, you know, and so like metrics are my life, like really. And it can be so frustrating sometimes where, maybe frustrating is not the right word. It can be misleading sometimes because there has to be a bit of a separation behind the user and the emotion, I suppose, that you're invoking on the person absorbing your content, and also the algorithm, right? The shares, the metrics, the data points. I've developed my own kind of internal coping mechanism to constantly bounce between the ebb and flow of data and people. What has been your balancing act for that?
Yeah, it's something I haven't actually talked too much about, because I think a lot of people who are straight up business people they're creative in one way, but they're maybe not creative in like a pure creative way. So like one of our mutual friends, Jack Butcher, like I do a podcast with him as well nowadays, and I've got to know him quite well. He's a pure creative guy. Like he needs to design stuff because that's part of his being, you know? And most people don't know that about me, but I'm the same. So whether that is like, as I just look at the things I did as a kid. I used to make music in my bedroom. I used to like, you know, not really well, but just for fun. I would edit videos. I would create PowerPoint slides when I was like 8 years old, you know, like, and to me, it was all those kind of pure creative things. Those are creative, but we don't think of those as creative most of the time. And now what it is like writing is a part of it. And then the podcast as well. And the way I find balance is honestly just like making time for it. And just in that time, I have dedicated time. I make sure I don't have distractions. I'm not in meetings all day. And now I'm able to do that because I've designed my week to be like that. In a job, it's harder to do that. But when I was in a job, I did the same thing every evening. Like I used to do like spoken word, which is random and I don't even do it anymore. But I used to go and perform in New York 5 days a week at one point. At open mics, and I'd go to work looking all, you know, professional, and then I'd go to the gym, and then straight after I'd be out till midnight, sometimes later, with random people who were in completely different worlds. And for me, that again, it came back to the energy. It was meeting those people, not talking about work, not talking about metrics, and completely taking my mind space out of that world. And sometimes that's what you need to do. So I think it's become harder over the last year for everyone who's been working from home and they haven't designed their space to be a place where they get a real break. So the room, if you're watching this, I'm in a dedicated room for this, and I don't come in here unless I'm working. And when I'm not working, I'm in other parts of the house, or I go outside and do stuff outside. So I think that's the thing, is like having some sort of separation, not just in terms of work-life balance, but for me, it's like the creative part. Like creative is not work or life. It's like in between a lot of the time. And I almost see it as a third bucket. Like I need dedicated space just to work on that, and dedicated time. So if I can time box it, then I actually stay consistent with it. Otherwise, if I don't prioritize it, it just kind of, things take over and you don't end up doing any of it like you plan to do.
A third bucket, I think that's a really good way to visualize it, because creativity is this, you can quantify results, right? Like what's the point, at least from a business standpoint, and Copyblogger is a writing community. And so I'm glad that you mentioned writing, but it's a topic that comes up often in our membership platform in Copyblogger Pro, where I remind people, yeah, you're creative writers, but don't get it twisted. Like you're spending time and you're working on something. Get money, you know, you have to figure out how to convert that creative energy into sales, or else it's just a hobby. It's not a business. And if it's a hobby, that's fine, but we're here.
But you should know what it is. And that's a good point, because I'd say with the podcast, it started as a hobby or something on the side, but I was always pretty I took it pretty seriously. Like, I taught myself how to edit. I learned all about sound. And, you know, in hindsight, that took a crazy amount of time where I could have outsourced it. But now I think I understand the craft of podcasting as well as most people I meet. And that to me is valuable. But if you are optimizing only for business and only for getting most number of downloads, I would do things very differently. I would do shorter episodes. I would do things in a certain way. So yeah, I agree, man. I think people need to kind of at least go in with a plan. And one thing again, that interview I did with Tim Urban was really something he said to me really stuck with me, which was he was doing something on the side, and Wait But Why or whatever he was writing wasn't really taking off because it was on the side. And what he found out was he needed to treat it like a business. He needed to take it seriously. And what that meant for him was he quit what he was doing, and then he really focused on this blog, and it blew up. But he basically said, well, what would I do if I had 50 hours a week to work on this versus 5? And just that, like, mental exercise makes a huge difference, because maybe you don't have 50 hours right now, but maybe you can work towards getting to that point. And more importantly, you're telling yourself, I'm going to take this seriously, and I'm going to make sure I do the things that I need to do to make this a business one day, or at least earn something so that it pays for itself. But again, like you said, if that's not the case and it's your hobby, that's great too. Like, that's a really important part of your life potentially. Sometimes when you turn it into a business, it becomes less fun. So it's just a fine balance between knowing up front why you're doing it and sticking to that. And if that evolves over time, then great. But I think I do this every 3 to 6 months. I go back and I say, am I still happy with what I'm doing? Am I spending too much time on some things that I shouldn't be? Like, I've done this right now. I had an editor that's worked with me for several years. She just took a full-time job, and I was editing my own stuff again, which, as you know, it takes forever. And especially the way I do it. But it was a chance for me to get back in the craft and kind of redefine, like, okay, what do I want to do? Do I want to change the format? Do I want to cut things down? Do I want to switch things up on the visuals? And now I'm getting an editing team back up, but it's got there's a new energy to the podcast again. So I think you need that every once in a while to just keep reinventing yourself and whatever you're creating.
Yeah, I think so too. And I want to talk a little bit more about the business of the podcast. If we're going to mention that, then I want to make sure we provide some value there. But real quick anecdote, one thing that's always really helped me, I was obsessed with Bruce Lee as a kid, and I'm sure a lot of people have seen the video interview he did where he said, be like water, right? Where if you're on too much one side, you're a mechanical man, but if you're on the other side, you're overly flexible. And that has always been a good mental recalibration point for me, where I feel like, no, I'm being way too mechanical on this side. Like, I'm caring too much about the metrics. I'm caring too much about this. Or on this other side, I'm being...
Yeah, I like that distinction.
Yeah, exactly. Like, way too loosey-goosey and not actually caring about what my objective is. So that's helped me. Okay. We had just talked a little bit about having an objective. And over time, your podcast has turned into an actual business. I like your model because we advocate, I got nothing wrong with ads, but at Copyblogger, we always advocate creating content for the sake of selling your own product, selling your own service, selling something where there's like maximum upside for you. Open-ended question here. Tell me how your content, your podcast has best suited you in the business goals that you've had.
Yeah. First of all, I agree with what you said. I don't think ads are the best way to make money long term, though I'm not against them. I have sponsorships on my podcast, but over time, I actually launched with sponsors, which is quite unique. Most people don't do that. I can share a little bit on that if you want in a second. But over the years, I've had sponsors. Again, this is not multi-million-dollar deals, to put it in perspective, right? But it's a good amount that it makes a profit, and it can pay for editing and all that sort of stuff. But what I thought about was, to put some numbers behind it, I think your audience probably know a lot of this sort of stuff already. If they, write and they're bloggers or they do SEO stuff, the metrics like CPM, right? So the cost per 1,000 impressions is normally how you sell ads on a podcast. On average, just to give you a benchmark, it's between $18 and $25 is the industry average. Some of them are $50 to $100 sometimes you can charge if you've got premium content. Even at that high level is for online advertising, that's pretty high, right? But to me, I'm like, am I going to sell 1,000 people listening to this for $25? Like that to me seems silly, because I could sell something that to one person for more than that, and it's worth a lot more. So the way I started to think about it was on what I also have is a agency consulting business. So I have a digital marketing agency. So they kind of sit side by side. I don't even proactively promote the agency because I'm not like in take over the world mode with it. I'm just like, I want it on the side that it basically pays for everything. It makes a good profit every year. But I'm actually using those profits to essentially have a flexible life, which is kind of what I'm optimizing for. For someone else, they want to get to $10-20 million a year in revenue, and that's great. For me, I'm not optimizing for that at the moment. So what I do is I use the podcast primarily to meet great people. Like I said before, that means you build a reputation for yourself. Yes. If someone listens to my podcast for 2 hours, which often is the case, they get to hear how I think. They know all my flaws, and they also know probably what I'm good at, because they've heard me talk about business for hundreds of hours by this point. And so that's the first part. It's like putting yourself out there and accepting, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to say a stupid word and whatever. Like you just get more confident with it, and you kind of just start to accept that feeling. And then it means then I can go and, if I have a consulting project, like I've had consulting projects directly from guests on the show in a few cases, but also people who have, come and work for me because, I built a reputation for myself. And of course, combined with real experience before. It wasn't like, hey, I just started podcasting and now I'm qualified to do what I do with the agency. But it was a way for me to demonstrate my competency and get my name out there. So, and that, I'd say that's still an ongoing process. So again, to put the numbers in perspective, why should I sell 1,000 people's eyeballs or ears for $25 when I can sell one client 10, 15, 20 grand in consultancy per month, right? That's kind of like the range I work in. So I'm not trying to like show off with numbers. I'm just trying to give a contrast between $25 and 10,000, let's say. So that's kind of how I see it. I also think ultimately long term for a lot of people, not just me, I think having a direct connection with your listeners is really important. So that's something I haven't done yet, but I would consider in the future. So whether that is a Patreon model, or some sort of subscription. I think you guys have something similar where people are paying for something every month. So yeah, I think that's a really great way for people to monetize as well. And then you're less reliant on advertising. You're not tiptoeing around saying the wrong thing. But the last thing I'll say on sponsorships is I've had some great sponsors even recently. I actually stopped doing sponsors last August when I kind of relaunched the show with I went to once a week and I put so much energy into it, got really big guests. And I said, I'm just not going to do ads for a while and just focus on creating good stuff. And what eventually happened was I got inbound from sponsors and I could at least kind of create things on my own terms and say, look, I'm not really like looking for sponsorships, but if you do want to do it, I'm not going to like turn down free money essentially. But this is how I just show you how I do it. And I can just tell you, I do it on a flat fee. I don't do any reporting. I don't tell you like this many people downloaded or listened all the way through. I just say like, this is like a content partnership and there's like a brand alignment. Like if I'm getting all these great guests, it's like an event basically. Like if you've ever gone to Web Summit, yeah, they're charging by how many people come to the show or come to the event, but they're also aligning with Jeff Bezos on stage, and stuff like that. So I went to more of that model because it just is simpler for me. And I tell people up front and I make sure I manage their expectations. and I'm still supportive. Like I introduce them to people and I like big them up outside of the podcast and tell people, oh, they're my sponsors and they're great to work with and stuff like that. So I try to add value, but ultimately I kind of had to say to them, I'm not, like, it's not worth my time, to be honest, like to do all this reporting stuff. I'd rather spend that time and energy on like getting more consulting clients. So if we are going to do it, like it has to be kind of on these terms. And if you're okay with that, then yeah, I'd love to do it together. I also make sure I have creative freedom. So I ask them for like bullet points of stuff that I can share, and then I do it in my voice. And no one's had a problem with that because, you know, generally it sounds fine. But like, I think some people are worried like, oh, am I going to bring a sponsor on and then they're going to take over the content and they're going to be annoyed that I mentioned this thing. I don't care about that. Like the reason I do this is because I want to create stuff authentically to me. So that's also kind of in the terms and conditions, essentially.
There's so many nuggets in that last 5 minutes of conversation. And I kind of, perfect example. When you talked about building a reputation and the things that you say, we're like, oh, I said something stupid. I cannot stop saying kinda when I do podcasts. And every single time I re-listen to them, and I actually don't re-listen to them that much anymore because I keep catching this mistake that I do. But the exercise in continuously putting yourself out there in spite of like your imperfections has some kind of unwarranted business skill, which I don't necessarily know how to
and
quantify.
Life skill, man. And it's like an acceptance of yourself.
Yes.
Like, you know what I mean? Like I now, when I meet people and I feel like I've been fairly comfortable being myself, but I feel like I'm 10 times more now because you know, you're putting yourself out there every day essentially. And I think the biggest thing is, this sounds very self-development-y, but I went to this thing once where they talked about a visualization of you walking down the street and looking around and you're thinking, oh my God, everyone's looking at me and they're looking at my gut right now or the spot on my face. And eventually it gets to the point where you start like smiling because you realize everyone is thinking exactly the same thing. And it's such a powerful moment. I was literally in a room where I saw someone crying, I saw someone laughing because we all kind of got it at the same time. And we were like, oh, that's how everyone's thinking. So now, if you walk around like that all day, of course, don't be arrogant and overly confident, but you start to realize like everyone's worried about themselves. You just be yourself. And also, I think comes with maturity, understanding that you're not perfect. And when you are younger, especially for me, when you're younger, you're trying to prove yourself and you're trying to say, well, look at me. And a lot of the time it's because when you're 12 years old or 7 years old, something happened to you, you don't even remember anymore. And you've got this kind of cut in your brain now. And every time you're put in that situation, you react in a certain way. So a lot of that comes from self-work, maybe therapy for some people, or at least understanding what's happened. And then you can realize, okay, I'm not trying to prove myself. Like to a certain extent, of course, we all are in some ways. I still care about what people think of me, 100%. But I'm also not the 18-year-old Bilal who was self-conscious about certain things and needed to prove to the world, look at me. You know what I mean? Whereas now, yeah, maybe that comes from having some success in air quotes, right? But it comes from doing stuff consistently where you see competence in yourself and you prove to yourself, oh, I'm actually pretty good at that, you know? And when you find that thing that you're good at, for me anyway, maybe this isn't everyone, you keep doing it, you get that confidence and you accept when other people are going to criticize you, it's normally because they should really be criticizing themselves, you know? So yeah, I don't know if that answers your point, but I definitely feel like it makes me a more accepting person of myself. You know what I mean?
It did totally answer my point, and I'll tell you why. Because you mentioned it, like podcasts are actually terrible businesses. Like if you want to get rich on a podcast, you need like 10 million downloads a month, right? And so the value from them has to be not as direct, right? There's more like abstract values from doing a podcast. And so here's where it gets funny, at least for me. The longer that I've done the podcast, the more I've openly talked about some of my successes, some of my failures. Maybe I've had episodes where I talk about really big clients that I was nervous about, what have you. And the act of, like you said, putting yourself out there, just getting a little bit more comfortable with being vulnerable, it's that weird life lesson, right? Where the less that you try to prove to other people that you're good, the more people start coming to you saying like, hey, I really like what you had to say. You seem like you're competent. You seem like you have an understanding of this industry. What do you think about working together? And I don't know this for sure, but I'm willing to make a bet that if I were to say you probably have gotten more clients in your consulting firm over the last year in like direct correlation with your vulnerability, right? I mean, I'm swinging for the fences on that one.
Yeah,
but
no,
I
mean, that's a good, I don't know if I've even thought about that, but I'd say beyond just the consultancy, but just looking at a wider aperture of career, being able to basically be honest. And I think a lot of people, especially at the highest level, I'm not saying I've worked at the highest level in every way, but like, Google hired from, pretty good group of people. Most of the people there were like top of their class. They've got great experience. And then when I went to Charity Water, in that world anyway, they were kind of the leaders in their space. They hired people from like, lots of big brands and really great people. And just being able to test yourself against those people, essentially, not in like a competitive way, but just I've like read books about this since I was 12 years old. Like, what's it like to manage someone? Like when someone's crying in front of you because they've got a personal problem in their life, how did I actually react? You know what I mean? As their manager or whatever. And those are the sorts of things you can't really test that unless you're doing it day to day. And I think back to your point about like vulnerability, essentially, it comes from being able to be completely honest. And that's a tough thing to do because we all aren't 100% honest, obviously, right? No one's completely perfect in that way. And it's the hardest one is being honest with yourself in your own head. Like you convince yourself, why haven't I been promoted? Oh my God, because the manager's stupid, blah, 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 blah. Like the story you tell in your head. And eventually when you're really honest with yourself, yeah, maybe there's stuff that was out of your control that messed up, which often does happen. But you can at least take some ownership of something that you could have done. And I'm not like Jocko Willink, like take complete control, ownership of yourself. But no, I think what he talks about is actually quite useful. Maybe he's like quite extreme about it, but being able to say, all right, what did I do wrong? What could I improve? And if you can honestly say to yourself, I did everything I could, well, then you're happy. Even if the result wasn't right, you put in the effort. And so that's kind of how I think about it, man.
I love that. All right, we got about 10 minutes left. Let's finish up on the technical end of the bit that we've been talking about. So your podcast is more or less turning into a distribution channel for your services. I want to make a point on this because one of the things we hear a lot in Copyblogger with people that are interested in creating a media brand for themselves is, I'm never going to be able to get tens of thousands of hits, like, well, you're a Copyblogger, you guys have a million hits. However, like, that's not me. I'm never going to get there. But what I love about what you said, and something that I just feel so passionately about, is when you move away from the ad model, which by the way is fine, but you more go towards something that's self-serving, you can get 100 listens. And if you get one client out of those 100 listens, you're killing it. And I think in this new, not necessarily new, but in the age where everybody is almost forced to be a media company more so than ever, that is the best approach to take, because the reach of the distribution that your podcast or your blog or your email list has isn't as important as the trust that you are establishing with your audience. Because if you establish trust, then you establish proof. And if you establish proof, then you basically establish, like you said, a reputation. And then that reputation is what converts to a sale. So I think that's probably a statement even more than a question, but I wanted to piggyback off that point that you made, because I think that's so important for people that are like just getting started, that they don't need a huge reach. They just need to have an impact.
Can I just add one thing to what you just said there as well?
Please.
The way I just think of it is, forget all the metrics and the channels and the distribution and organic reach and all the stuff we all care about, right? And we've learned the tactics, but like just take a step back and think about what did our grandparents do when they wanted to get a job or start a business, right? It was networking and word of mouth. Most of the time, you obviously have to develop some skills, but I'm talking about getting yourself out there. Like that's really my background, is marketing and sales, right? So I just think of word of mouth, and I think of scaling word of mouth. And the cool thing is, especially for your audience, word of mouth now can include Google search, right? Because if you think really what Google search is just a database for what was spread and voted on by the whole network of the internet, right? The way Google knows that your site is valuable is because you've got so many backlinks of votes, which back in the day, a few generations ago, were people telling their friends, oh, I read this blog post or this memo and you should check it out. Now people can do that through backlinks or other signals on social media and stuff like that. So I've never actually thought of it like this. I'm just making this up on the spot, but I think of it all as word of mouth, which is, how do I scale word of mouth? How do I get myself in front of more people that are relevant? If that's your objective, I will just clarify one thing. I genuinely am doing the podcast for its own sake. Like I do get some benefit on the business side, but like I do it mainly just because I love doing it. But I do think that there's one story I'll share is when I was in Charity Water, my job there was to create brand partnerships with brands to raise money for the world water crisis. That was kind of my team's job. And I remember meeting this guy, and he's like kind of a hot shot in Manhattan. He owns a bunch of restaurants, and I had this crazy idea for this restaurant project. And long story short, I met him, and he was like a little bit cold, right? And he was just strictly business. And I was like, okay, I left the meeting like, okay, I don't think anything's going to happen. And then at the end of the meeting, my colleague mentioned that I had a podcast. And he was like, oh, I'm like a huge podcast listener. Cool, I'll check it out. And his whole tone changed. And after 2-3 weeks, we went to meet him again. And when I met him, he was like, oh man, I've listened to like every single episode of your podcast. They're so good. I love them so much. And we're like now friends, right? And it's we're still in touch, even though we don't work together. And that was scaling word of mouth in his head, you know, like while I wasn't there was someone speaking in his ear, whether that was me or, you know, the recording of me anyway. And there was a way to scale yourself beyond just, you know, physical people. And that's kind of the craziest thing when you think about it. We're so used to hearing it now of like a tweet can reach 1 million people or a YouTube video can go viral. But just think how crazy that is, man, that we have the ability to create one thing, like what we're recording right now. How many people are going to listen to this? Even if it's 12 people or if it's 12 million people, it's just an incredible thing that it can multiply to that many people. So that's how I think of every piece of content now. If the objective is to get it out to more people, how do I scale word of mouth? And this is my way of doing it.
That is such a cool story. I love what you said about how would your grandparents get out there. As an SEO, I talk to a lot of clients, they ask about backlinks a lot, and they say, how do you get backlinks? And what I actually say is, we don't focus on getting backlinks. We focus on getting people to talk about us. And the analogy I use is almost exactly the one that you did. I think mine's just a slight variation, where I say, if you are throwing a garage sale and you want people to come to your garage sale, like, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to knock on the local stores in your neighborhood. You're going to hang some shit on, some flyers up on the telephone post. Like, you're just going to put yourself out there. And that's really all the internet is, except it's that times like a gazillion.
A billion. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And here's a cool place to end on, because that story I thought was so cool. And I had a really, really similar experience, which pertains to people who feel like the stuff that they're publishing isn't getting read or isn't getting listened to. I have been slowly working on this idea called agency clarity, which is basically putting resources together for young start entrepreneurs that know they want to start their own business, but don't necessarily know where to start. And my advice to them is always start a service business, right? Like, master a skill, start working with clients. And so I've been putting some stuff together, and I put a free course out there. And I think it's gotten maybe 150 downloads. Maybe. I haven't checked my email in a while. And I was really proud of this course. It's the first time I've ever created like a product from front to back without having like a team around it. And just yesterday morning, I got a DM in my tweets saying, hey, I just finished your course. I've been thinking about this so much, and exactly what you said. The lesson one in my course is to be specific, like just find like a real particular niche. And so the only reason I say that is because this person DM'd me saying, I've had this idea about this one particular niche that I wanted to work in with an agency, but I just thought it was a crazy idea. And after listening to you, like, you really inspired me to take that action. And so the lesson is that you might not think people are listening, and you might not think people are reading, but they are. I promise you they are. And like, your content and your voice and your message has a lot more impact than you might realize.
Yeah, that's a great point, man. I think even for someone like me, who I would see my podcast stats, and honestly, this is kind of a funny, embarrassing thing to say, but for years I was like, this must be wrong. You know, like, who are these random people in like these different countries listening to my podcast? And I was like, it must be bots or something. And it was only when I started saying on the podcast, if you like this, send me a message on Twitter. I really focused instead of like Instagram, email. I was asking people to do too many things. I said, if you like it, DM me on Twitter or write something on Twitter @Zaidi. And then every day I started getting messages from people. And you know, I don't have like a huge following on Twitter or anything, but I get messages from people all the time. And now honestly, I save a lot of those messages in like a folder, because when it gets really crazy and you really need to remind yourself of like why you're doing it, I like go back in there and I'm like, oh, Rahul from 2019 sent me this message, and like, I want to reach another Rahul. It's gonna kind of get me going to keep going, man. So yeah, I love that, man. Just definitely stick to what you're doing.
Yeah, well, damn, if you're listening to this, DM me on Twitter.
100%.
@Tim Stoddart, would appreciate it. So, all right, man, thank you so much for your time. I enjoyed every second of this conversation. So what do we got? We got creatorlab.fm.
Yeah, that's the website. And if people, you know, if you're probably listening to this on a podcast app, if you're interested, just subscribe to Creator Lab on any podcast app, Spotify, Apple. Also, all the videos on YouTube if you prefer video. I also include timestamps, so if you need to switch between video and audio, those are really helpful. You get a preview. And just because it's your audience, I'll just say, if you're someone who writes, there's probably a few episodes you could start with, because I hate when people are like, just check out my podcast, because there's too many to start with. There's one with Polina Marinova, who was a writer. Oh, she's got the profile. She's incredible. She was a writer at Fortune, I think, and then went full-time herself. She's like got one of the biggest Substack email newsletters, and we talk all about the craft of writing and all these like very actionable things that are really useful. The one with Tim Urban, Wait But Why as well. He built his blog pretty much on SEO and organic, but really about great content and the craft of that. And yeah, there's a bunch of others as well. I think a lot of people might like the one with Sam Parr and Jack Butcher and Pomp. Those three were like a cluster I did around audience building. So they're all about the different ways to build an audience, very specific stuff. And if you are on Twitter as well, just look me up @Zaidi. Maybe you can share it in the show notes or something. And look at my pinned tweet. That one was all about a summary of like 10, 12 hours of podcasts, all about how to build an audience and beyond just like writing stuff every day, like, you know, actual tangible stuff that will help you. So yeah, hopefully that's let me know what you think of this. I'd love to hear from you as well @Zaidi.
Yeah, and let's not forget your newest brilliant project. Not Thanks, investment advice. It's important you know that.
Yeah, that's actually the name. So I've started a new podcast with Jack Butcher, who has got a social following on @VisualizeValue. He's great. We've kind of become internet friends through my podcast. Another guy called Trung Fan, who's a lead writer at the Hustle newsletter. He's hilarious on Twitter. He's like a meme god. So we talk every week about the crazy stuff we're finding out on the edges of the internet, the business world, internet. So yeah, you might also like that podcast. So check that out too.
Nice, man. Well, Bilal, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, man.
I'll be in New York probably in a month and a half or so.
Oh, awesome.
When I'm up there.
Yeah, let me know. Just DM me, man. We'll definitely link up.
All right, brother. Appreciate your time.
All right, brother. Have a good one. Cheers.